Today, we're taking a deep dive into a controversial perspective on unions in Canada, exploring whether they're a force for good or, as our source claims, a socioeconomic tumor.
That's quite the inflammatory comparison. It certainly sets the stage for a lively discussion. The source we're analyzing is an article titled "U Utka," that translates to, "In Canada, unions are a socioeconomic tumor that should be excised."
Wow. They don't hold back, do they? It sounds like the author has a strong opinion about Canadian unions.
Definitely. And one of their main arguments revolves around comparing union strength in Canada and the US. Imagine this. In Canada, roughly 3 out of every 10 workers you see are union members. That's what we call union density. Compare that to the US, where it's closer to 1 in 10 workers.
So right off the bat, we see a big difference in how many workers are represented by unions in the two countries.
Exactly. And the source argues that this higher union density in Canada gives unions a lot more power when it comes to negotiating with employers and influencing government policies. They particularly point to the public sector in Canada, where unions have historically been very strong.
Okay, so we've got this picture of powerful unions in Canada, especially in areas like healthcare and education. But the article claims this is actually a bad thing.
That's their argument. They contend that while unions aim to improve working conditions for their members, they might also hinder economic growth in the process.
I can see how that might be a concern. How exactly do they claim unions are holding the economy back?
Well, one of their main points is that unions drive up labor costs. They argue that when unions push for higher wages and benefits, it can make Canadian businesses less competitive, especially when compared to businesses in countries with lower labor costs.
I guess that makes sense from a business perspective. But wouldn't higher wages for workers mean they have more money to spend, which could actually boost the economy? Does the article address that side of the argument?
They do touch on the issue of minimum wage, which is significantly higher in Canada than in many parts of the US. The article suggests that this is a direct result of union influence and that it puts Canadian businesses at a disadvantage.
Wouldn't a higher minimum wage also help lift people out of poverty and create a more equitable society? It seems like there's a trade-off between economic competitiveness and social well-being.
You've hit on a key tension in this debate. The article tends to focus on the potential negative economic impacts of unions without giving equal weight to the potential social benefits.
So it's a bit of a one-sided perspective so far.
Well, it's fair to say. Another point they raise is the difficulty in laying off workers when unions are involved. Union contracts often include provisions that make it harder for companies to let go of employees, even during economic downturns.
I can see if that could be frustrating for businesses, especially if they're struggling to stay afloat. But isn't there also a benefit to having some level of job security? Doesn't it create a more stable workforce and reduce anxiety for workers?
Those are valid points, and they highlight the complexity of this issue. The article argues that while some job security can be beneficial, too much protection can make businesses inflexible and ultimately lead to more job losses in the long run.
Okay, so they're saying that there needs to be a balance between protecting workers and allowing businesses to adapt to changing economic conditions.
Exactly. They also bring up the issue of strikes, particularly in essential sectors like transportation and healthcare. They argue that these strikes, while intended to benefit workers, can cripple vital services and inflict significant economic damage on the country.
Yeah, we saw that firsthand with the dock workers' strike earlier this year. Didn't that cost billions of dollars and disrupt supply chains across the country?
That's the example they cite.
Oh.
Along with the federal public service strike in 2022, which slowed down government services. They argue that these types of disruptions ultimately harm everyone, not just the businesses directly involved.
It sounds like they're building a case that while unions might have good intentions, their actions can sometimes backfire and hurt the very people they're trying to help.
That's a key theme in their argument. They also contend that strong unions, particularly in the public sector, contribute to higher taxes and government spending. They argue that when public sector unions negotiate for higher wages and benefits, it ultimately burdens taxpayers.
So their argument seems to be that unions create this ripple effect where their demands for higher wages and job security lead to higher costs for businesses, more government spending, and ultimately a less competitive economy.
You've captured their line of reasoning quite well, and they tie this economic argument to a larger critique of what they see as a culture of entitlement fostered by unions.
That's an interesting angle.
Yeah.
What do they mean by a culture of entitlement?
They argue that unions promote the idea that workers are entitled to certain benefits and protections, regardless of their individual performance or the financial health of their employer. They suggest that this mindset can make workers less productive and less willing to adapt to changing circumstances.
So they're saying that unions might actually hinder individual initiative and make workers complacent.
That's the implication. They contrast this with what they perceive as a more individualistic and merit-based work culture in the U.S., where workers are allegedly more motivated to excel and where businesses have more flexibility to operate without union constraints.
It sounds like they're painting a pretty black and white picture of the two countries.
That's a fair observation. And it's important to remember that these are generalizations and there are always exceptions to the rule. But their core argument is that Canada's strong union presence has created an environment that is less conducive to economic growth and innovation compared to the U.S.
Okay, so they've laid out some pretty strong criticisms of Canadian unions.
Yeah.
But this is just one perspective, right?
Absolutely. It's crucial to consider the counter-arguments and to explore the potential benefits that unions bring to the table. And that's exactly what we'll do in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so in part one, we heard some pretty harsh criticism of Canadian unions, with the article even going so far as to call them a tumor on the economy. But as we all know, there are two sides to every story. What about the arguments in favor of unions? Do the potential benefits outweigh those concerns?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's important to remember that unions didn't just spring up out of nowhere. They emerged from very real historical struggles for worker rights. Think back to the early days of industrialization with long hours, unsafe working conditions, and minimal worker protections.
Yeah. Those were pretty dark times for workers.
Absolutely. Unions emerged as a way for workers to band together and demand better treatment from their employers. And they've played a crucial role in achieving many of the workplace rights we take for granted today.
Like what kind of rights are we talking about?
Well, think about things like the 40-hour work week, paid vacation time, sick leave, and even the right to form a union in the first place. These weren't gifts from benevolent employers. They were hard-won victories achieved through collective bargaining and, yes, sometimes strikes.
So historically, unions have been a force for positive change in the workplace.
Without a doubt. And while the article focuses on the potential downsides of unions, it's important to also acknowledge the potential upsides. For example, unions can help raise wages for all workers, not just their members. When unions negotiate higher wages for their members, it can create pressure on other employers to raise wages in order to attract and retain workers. This can benefit the entire workforce, not just those in unions.
So there's a potential ripple effect that could boost wages across the board.
Exactly. And higher wages can actually stimulate the economy. When people have more money in their pockets, they tend to spend more, which increases demand for goods and services, leading to economic growth.
That makes sense. It's not just about costs for businesses, it's about the overall health of the economy. But the article argues that those higher wages can make businesses less competitive globally, especially against companies in countries with lower labor costs. How do you address that concern?
It's true that labor costs are a factor in business competitiveness, but it's important to remember that wages aren't the only factor. Things like productivity innovation and access to skilled workers also play a role.
So it's a more nuanced picture than just focusing on wages alone.
Precisely. And there's research to suggest that unionized workplaces often have higher productivity and lower turnover rates.
It's interesting. Why would unionized workplaces be more productive?
Well, one reason is that unions often advocate for training and professional development opportunities for their members. This can lead to a more skilled and knowledgeable workforce, which can boost productivity.
So rather than simply demanding higher wages, unions are also invested in improving the skills and capabilities of their members.
Exactly. And when workers feel valued and invested in, they're more likely to be engaged and productive.
Okay, so there's a potential upside for both workers and businesses. What about the argument that unions make businesses less flexible, particularly when it comes to laying off workers?
That's a legitimate concern. But it's important to consider the potential benefits of job security. When workers have a reasonable expectation that they won't be arbitrarily laid off, it can create a more stable and loyal workforce.
I can see that. It would reduce anxiety and allow workers to focus on their jobs rather than constantly worrying about losing them.
Right. And it can also encourage workers to invest in their skills and knowledge. Knowing that their jobs are relatively secure, this can ultimately benefit businesses by creating a more skilled and productive workforce.
So there's a potential trade-off between flexibility and stability, and it's about finding the right balance.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the role unions play in advocating for workplace safety. Unions have a long history of fighting for safer working conditions, and they often have more leverage than individual workers to push for improvements.
Yeah, that's a huge issue, especially in industries like construction or manufacturing where the risks are higher.
Absolutely. And unions can also help ensure that workers have access to benefits like health insurance and retirement plans, which can improve their overall well-being and financial security.
So it's not just about wages and job security. It's about creating a work environment where workers feel valued, respected, and protected.
That's a key point. And while the article paints unions as solely focused on their own narrow interests, it's important to remember that unions often advocate for policies that benefit all workers, not just their members.
Like what kind of policies?
Think about things like universal health care, affordable childcare, and paid family leave. These are policies that can improve the lives of all workers, regardless of their human status.
So they're not just fighting for a bigger slice of the pie. They're trying to make the pie bigger for everyone.
Exactly. And they often play a role in promoting social justice and equality. For example, unions have been at the forefront of movements for racial and gender equality in the workplace.
So they have a broader social impact that goes beyond just wages and working conditions.
Absolutely. And let's not forget about the power of collective bargaining. When workers come together as a collective, they have a much stronger voice when negotiating with their employers. This can lead to better outcomes for everyone involved.
But the article argues that this collective bargaining power can also be used to disrupt the economy, particularly through strikes. How do you respond to that concern?
It's true that strikes can be disruptive, and no one likes them, but they're often a last resort for workers who feel they have no other option. And while strikes can cause short-term economic losses, they can also lead to long-term gains, both for workers and for society as a whole.
Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. Think about the civil rights movement in the U.S. Strikes and boycotts played a huge role in pressuring businesses and governments to change discriminatory policies. Sometimes disruption is necessary to achieve progress.
So while strikes might be painful in the short term, they can be a catalyst for positive social change.
That's the argument. And it's important to remember that the right to strike is a fundamental labor right recognized by international organizations like the International Labor Organization. It's a way for workers to have a voice and to ensure that their concerns are heard.
But the article suggests that strikes in essential sectors like transportation and healthcare can have a devastating impact on the public. How do you balance the right to strike with the need to protect essential services?
That's a complex issue, and there's no easy answer. One solution that's been proposed is the concept of sectoral bargaining.
Okay, I've heard that term thrown around, but I'm not entirely sure what it means.
So instead of negotiating contracts on a company-by-company basis, sectoral bargaining involves negotiating agreements that cover all workers in a particular industry or sector.
Interesting. What are the potential benefits of that?
Well, proponents argue that it could help level the playing field and prevent a race to the bottom on wages and working conditions. Imagine if all restaurant workers in Ontario, regardless of which restaurant they worked for, negotiated their contracts together. That's sectoral bargaining in action.
Okay, I get it now. So it's like setting industry-wide standards that everyone has to adhere to.
Exactly. And it could be particularly beneficial in industries where there's a lot of competition and where workers are vulnerable to exploitation.
So sectoral bargaining could be a way to balance the needs of workers and businesses while also ensuring that essential services are protected.
That's the idea. And it's just one example of the innovative solutions that are being explored to address the challenges and opportunities presented by unions in Canada.
Okay, so we've seen that there are strong arguments both for and against unions. They've played a vital role in advancing worker rights, but they can also create challenges for businesses and the economy. It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
You've summed it up perfectly. And ultimately, it's up to each individual to weigh the evidence and decide where they stand on this issue.
Well said. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to go back to something the article mentioned, the potential impact of a conservative government on the future of unions in Canada. They seem to suggest that a conservative government would be more likely to introduce policies that weaken unions.
That's a possibility. And they pointed to past actions by conservative governments like Stephen Harper's attempts to limit union power as evidence for this prediction. But it's not a foregone conclusion. Not all conservatives hold the same views on unions, and there are a range of perspectives within the party.
So it's not as simple as saying conservative government equals bad news for unions.
Exactly. It would depend on a variety of factors, including the specific policies they choose to pursue and the level of public support for those policies.
Okay, so the future of unions in Canada is uncertain, and it will likely be shaped by a complex interplay of political, economic, and social forces.
Absolutely. And that's something to keep in mind as we continue our deep dive. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about some of the specific examples the article used to illustrate their arguments. They brought up several high-profile cases, like the closure of the Amazon distribution center in Quebec and the decline of the Canadian auto industry.
Yeah, those are pretty dramatic examples, and they seem to be at the heart of their argument that unions are driving businesses away from Canada.
Right. But it's important to examine those cases carefully and see if they actually support the article's claims. For example, in the case of the Amazon distribution center, while it's true that workers at the facility were in the process of unionizing when it closed, Amazon has denied that this was the sole reason for the closure.
So there might have been other factors at play.
Exactly. Amazon has cited things like the facility's location and its relatively small size as contributing factors. They've also argued that the facility wasn't meeting their performance standards.
So it's not a clear-cut case of unions driving a business away.
Not necessarily. It's likely that a combination of factors contributed to Amazon's decision. And it's difficult to say definitively what role, if any, the unionization effort played.
Okay, so it's a bit of a gray area. What about the decline of the Canadian auto industry? The article claimed that high labor costs associated with strong unions were a major reason for the decline of the sector.
That's a common argument, but it's also a simplification of a complex issue. While labor costs are certainly a factor in business decisions, they're not the only factor. Globalization, automation, and changes in consumer demand have also had a significant impact on the auto industry worldwide.
So it's not as simple as saying that unions are solely responsible for the decline of the Canadian auto industry.
Exactly. It's important to consider the broader economic and technological forces at play, and to remember that correlation doesn't always equal causation. Just because union density is high in Canada and the auto industry has declined doesn't mean that unions are the direct cause of that decline.
Okay, so we've seen that the specific examples used by the article don't necessarily support their claims as strongly as they suggest. What about their proposed solutions to the union problem? They talked about things like introducing right-to-work laws, banning strikes in essential sectors, and reforming public sector pay and benefits.
Right. And while we've already discussed some of the counter-arguments to those proposals, I think it's important to also consider the potential unintended consequences.
What do you mean by that?
Well, for example, right-to-work laws have been shown to lead to lower wages and fewer benefits for workers. Even those who choose not to join a union, they can also create a free rider problem where workers benefit from union representation without contributing financially, which can weaken unions' ability to effectively advocate for their members.
So while they might sound good in theory, they could actually harm workers in practice.
Exactly. And banning strikes in essential sectors could have serious consequences for public safety and service delivery. It could also lead to more adversarial labor relations, as workers would be left with fewer options for resolving disputes.
And reforming public sector pay and benefits could lead to a brain drain, as talented workers might leave the public sector for higher-paying jobs in the private sector.
Right. And it could also make it more difficult to attract and retain qualified individuals for essential public service jobs, such as teachers, nurses, and social workers.
So it's important to carefully consider the potential downsides of these proposed solutions.
Absolutely. There are no easy answers when it comes to complex issues like labor relations, and it's crucial to have a thoughtful and nuanced discussion that takes into account the perspectives of all stakeholders.
Well said. So we've heard the criticisms of unions, explored the potential benefits, and even delved into some of the specific examples and proposed solutions. Where do we go from here?
In the final part of our deep dive, we'll move beyond the criticisms and explore some alternative solutions that have been proposed to address the challenges and opportunities presented by unions in Canada.
Sounds fascinating. I'm eager to hear what those solutions might look like. Welcome back to the deep dive. It feels like we've gone a few rounds in the ring with this topic, unions in Canada. Our source definitely came out swinging, calling unions a socioeconomic tumor, but we've also unpacked some compelling counterpoints.
We've seen how unions have fought for worker rights and even contributed to a stronger economy in some ways. It's definitely a complex issue with valid arguments on both sides.
Totally.
Yeah.
And I think that's what makes this deep dive so interesting. So for this final round, let's shift gears from the criticisms and explore potential solutions. Because even with their benefits, no system is perfect.
Right.
There's always room for improvement.
Exactly. The question is, what does better look like? Our source basically called for a full-on removal of unions. But I think there are more nuanced and, frankly, more realistic approaches to address some of the challenges we've discussed.
Okay, so let's get into it. What are some alternative solutions that people are proposing?
Well, one area ripe for improvement is union transparency and accountability. Remember those concerns the article raised about how unions manage their funds and wield their power?
Yeah, they definitely painted a picture of potential misuse and lack of oversight.
Right. And I think addressing those concerns head on is crucial for maintaining public trust and ensuring unions are truly serving their members. Some people have suggested requiring unions to be much more open about their finances, their lobbying efforts, and how they make decisions.
It's kind of like shining a light on their inner workings to make sure everything's above board. I can see how that could build confidence.
Exactly. Another area with potential is promoting more collaborative labor relations. What if instead of that constant us versus them mentality, unions and employers work together more often?
Okay, so moving away from that adversarial relationship that we often see play out in the news.
Exactly. Imagine unions and employers partnering on things like skills training, apprenticeship programs, even workplace safety initiatives. There are already pockets where this is happening, and it can lead to a more stable and prosperous environment for everyone.
That sounds way more productive than constant conflict and standoffs.
Yeah.
Everyone wins if the pie is growing.
Right? That's the idea. Now, another interesting idea gaining traction is sectoral bargaining.
You mentioned that in part two, but to be honest, I'm still a little fuzzy on the details.
No problem. It's worth revisiting. Imagine instead of negotiating contracts company by company, all L workers in a specific industry. Let's say all grocery store workers across a province negotiate their contracts together. That's sectoral bargaining.
Okay. So it's about setting industry-wide standards rather than having each company duke it out separately.
Precisely. Proponents argue this could prevent a race to the bottom on wages and conditions, where companies undercut each other to save money, leaving workers worse off.
That makes sense. It's like creating a level playing field, so everyone has to meet a certain standard.
Exactly. And it could be particularly beneficial in industries with lots of competition or where workers are vulnerable to exploitation. Now we can't talk about the future of work without addressing the elephant in the room, technology.
Right. Automation, AI, all that stuff. Our source seemed to think technology would make unions obsolete.
I think that's a narrow view. Instead of fearing it, unions have a huge opportunity to embrace technology and help shape how it's implemented.
So working with employers to make sure workers benefit from these advancements rather than being replaced by them.
Exactly. Unions could advocate for things like retraining programs to help workers transition to new roles. Policies that ensure workers get a fair share of the productivity gains from automation, and even explore ideas like a basic income to provide a safety net for those who are displaced.
It's like instead of fighting the tide, they're riding the wave and steering it in a direction that benefits workers.
I like that analogy. It's a much more proactive and forward-thinking approach than simply trying to cling to the past.
Okay, so we've got increased transparency and accountability, more collaboration between unions and employers, the possibility of sectoral bargaining, and embracing the changes brought by technology. Those are some pretty concrete ideas.
They're definitely worth exploring. And ultimately, the key is for everyone involved, unions, employers, governments, and workers, to come to the table and have an open, honest conversation about how to create a labor market that's fair, equitable, and sustainable for the long haul.
That's such an important point. It's about finding solutions that work for everyone, not just one group or another.
Absolutely. And it's about recognizing that the world of work is constantly changing, and we need to be willing to adapt and innovate if we want a future where everyone has a chance to thrive.
Well said. So after this deep dive into Canadian unions, what stands out to me is that it's not a black and white issue. There are legitimate concerns and valid arguments on both sides.
I completely agree. The most important thing is to engage in thoughtful and respectful dialogue, be open to different viewpoints, and work together to find solutions that benefit everyone.